Charity were registered on the lobbyist list? Since I didn't know that there had been interactions with We Charity in terms of this COVID program, I wouldn't have had the opportunity or a reason to ask questions about lobbying and the Kilburgers. Did you ask Ms. Chager this question? As I said, I didn't know that We Charity had been selected to deliver this program during the process that was taking place. So I wouldn't have had a chance to ask any questions about lobbying. On April 9th, you announced the program right after We Charity was involved. And of course, you know that We Charity has been involved for quite some time, but you never asked any of your ministers or your members of your entourage to check to see if We Charity was registered on the lobbyist list. You have no knowledge of that? First, that is not the role of the Prime Minister to ask his ministers to check the lobbying list. We have people in our office to do that. They have to do their job. Second, We Charity invitation, I only received it on May 8th, once all these decisions and recommendations had been made by the public service.
And we're a little over. We'll turn to Mr. Angus for 6 minutes, who will be followed by Mr. Polyev and then Mr. McLeod. Mr. Angus.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for joining us today. I agree with you. Canadians are in the worst medical and economic catastrophe in a century. And I think what's very frustrating for me is that we've worked very hard across party lines to reassure Canadians that we are putting their interests first. And yet we're here today because of this, I think, very unnecessary scandal. And it comes down fundamentally to a question of your judgment. I mean, there were numerous red flags with this proposal. It fell apart the second it was announced. But the question that sticks with people is you've been found guilty twice of breaking the Conflict Interest Act. That you seem to have this, you give an impression anyways, that you don't believe that the laws that define what politicians can and cannot do applies to you. And so here we are with a case that was such an obvious conflict of interest because of your connection with the Kilburgers that has derailed so much good work and hurt students. Do you recognize what you've done here and the damage that's been done to all of us trying to reassure Canadians?
Mr. Prime Minister.
First of all, Mr. Angus, through this pandemic that, as you say, has been extraordinarily difficult and impactful on Canadians, we have remained focused on them. We have delivered to over 8 million Canadians the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, a wage subsidy that has kept businesses going, commercial rent assistance, support for seniors, support for students, a $9 billion package, of which, yes, this volunteer program was a part. And it is disappointing that we're not going to be able to give grants for students who are volunteering across the country so far, and we still are working on that, obviously. But at the same time, Mr. Angus, you need to know that we have delivered concretely for Canadians. We also, when I received the information that the We Charity was being chosen, recommended by Public Service to deliver the student grant program, I pushed back, perhaps because of the experience that you highlight that we have had
Prime Minister,
pushbacks in the past. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that all the I's were dotted, all the T's were crossed, that the Public Service was ready to fully justify that choice of We Charity as the only organization.
We're allowed to go back to Mr. Angus,
Thank
Prime
you.
Minister.
I guess the issue is that for Canadians, the idea that this was the only game in town, that we was the only game in town, I'm sure around your cabinet it probably was. But the fact is that the Kilburger brothers carefully cultivated their relationship with you and your brand. After you became Prime Minister, they put you on the stadium circuit. They hired your family members to the $2.5 million. They hired the finance minister's daughter. They flew him around the world. They even made their staff go to his parties. Do you think that that's not conflict of interest? Is that conflict of interest, yes or no?
Okay, from the very first, Mr. Angus, you were unfortunately misleading people with your proposal. This was not something that we selected. This is not something that Cabinet selected. Cabinet was presented a choice by our professional public service saying, if you want to deliver this summer volunteer program, the summer grant program, it's going to have to be with this through this third-party organization. They didn't give us a choice of 2 or 3 different organizations. So when you say that it was maybe the reality around the Cabinet table, but it wasn't necessarily the reality out there, you're actually impugning the very fine public servants who have
Mr. Trudeau,
extraordinary work across this pandemic on delivering for Canadians.
Yes.
And if they said there is no other organization that can deliver the scale of grants
back to Mr. Angus, Prime
then
Minister.
I believe
Thank you. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, I totally agree with you about the civil service. That's why your decision to privatize this and give it to the Kielburger brothers really concerns me. And what really concerns me is you didn't answer the question about whether or not that you thought that your close family financial relationships and the Morneau family close financial relationships is a conflict of interest. That is why we're here. We're not here because of the civil service. We're here because you don't seem to understand, Mr. Prime Minister, that conflict of interest applies to you. So when you tell us that We Charity was the only game in town, well, they were in your world. But obviously this deal fell apart, and you need to understand that your conflict of interest has put you here.
Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. Angus, your statement that in my world or in our cabinet, we were the only game in town is simply untrue. It is
That's what you said.
Professional public service that put forward the recommendation that said to us, having done their due diligence, that the only organization with the scale and the capacity to deliver this grant program would be we. Personally, I thought we were going to be able to deliver it through the Canada Service Corps, which I created 2 or 3 years ago and was all about rewarding service and creating opportunities for service for young people. I would have loved to seen it supercharged and accelerated to be able to deliver many thousands of opportunities for young people throughout the country. But that wasn't able to be done. And the public service themselves made the recommendation that we had to go with We Charity. And I was not involved in that
last
recommendation
question,
at all,
Mr. Angus, and it'll have to be a very quick one.
Well, very quickly, Mr. Prime Minister, as the former youth voice, you could have been talking to the Federation of Students when you were telling them that they were not eligible for CERB, when you told them to work for less than the minimum wage, when you pushed this deal with the Kielburger brothers and refused to recuse yourself, and not a dime has gone out the door.
Over to you, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you. Mr. Angus and the NDP have said this a few times, this idea that volunteering is somehow working for less than the minimum wage. I'd like to remind Mr. Angus that
Mr. Angus, the Prime Minister has the floor.
The heart of this country. And people get out and volunteer not for money, but because they want to make a difference in the world. And if you start calculating every volunteer as working for less than the minimum wage, then you are missing a really important part, Mr. Angus, of the fabric of Canada. And getting young people to step up and volunteer is something
we will have to end that round there, gentlemen. We are going now to 5-minute rounds, and we'll start with Mr. Poilievre, followed by Mr. McLeod. Mr. Poilievre, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I'll be taking Mr. Poilievre's time.
Oh, okay. Who was that yelled there?
MP Barrett, sir.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Mr. Barrett. Yeah, I had Mr. Poilievre on my list. I'll not take my talking from your time. You get the floor.
Thank you. Prime Minister, just looking for a number. How many times would one of your ministers need to be found guilty of breaking the Conflict of Interest Act for you to fire them? How many times, sir?
Obviously, our cabinet is formed of extraordinary individuals who serve their country, and I have confidence in their ability to do just that.
How many times would they need to break the act before you would fire them?
Obviously, anytime someone contravenes the Ethics Commissioners Act, we take it very seriously, and we'll look at each situation based on the gravity of the situation.
Okay, well, you claimed in your opening remarks that you had basically no idea what was happening in your government. Who are you holding accountable for this decision?
Mr. Barrett, over the past number of months, as a government and as a Prime Minister, I've been involved in the decisions around CERB, around the wage subsidy, around helping Canadians through this extraordinary time of crisis. We've been involved in working quickly and flexibly with an extraordinarily professional public service to deliver tremendous programs to help Canadians.
We will have to go back to Mr. Barrett,
every
Prime
aspect
Minister.
of many of these programs.
Prime Minister,
Mr.
there was
Barrett.
no vetting done of We Charity. There are major concerns with this organization. Who is responsible for the vetting?
The public service would have done their due diligence to ensure which organizations could deliver the program as we had laid it out. And they found that only We Charity had the ability to do that through their due diligence process.
Mr. Barrett.
The organization that you approved, sir, was, you had a massive contract given to a shell company with no experience running a government grant program. That's a problem. Someone should be held accountable. Who are you going to fire?
Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. Barrett, the public service, which has delivered extraordinary programs, including with third-party organizations. When we wanted to help out shelters, we went through United Way. When we wanted to help food banks, the public service reached out to Food Banks Canada to make sure that they could get that money out. They have consistently worked with third-party organizations. As part of their decision to do that, they have done full due diligence on that organization's ability to deliver the program. And
Prime Minister, Cabinet,
they were capable of
Prime
doing
Minister,
this
Cabinet is responsible for decisions, not the public service. A major mistake was made. Someone in Cabinet should be held accountable. Which minister will you fire? Minister Morneau, Minister Chagger, which minister?
The decision in Cabinet was not as to which organization should deliver the Canada Student Summer Grants. The decision in Cabinet was, should we have a summer grants program or not? That was the binary choice given to us by the public service and the minister, and Cabinet made a decision that creating opportunities for young people to serve across the country.
Do you still think We was a good
worthwhile.
choice? Do you still think We was a good choice to run this program, sir?
We will never know, because they pulled out of that being able to deliver the program, partially because I hadn't recused myself and created complications here, and that's something that I deeply regret, because creating opportunities for young people to serve is something that matters deeply to all Canadians across the country.
Mr. Barrett, I'll not take the time from you, Mr. Barrett, but somebody's got their mic on and some sound is coming through. Okay, Mr. Barrett.
Were you aware that the We organization had fired its board chair shortly before they were given this contract?
No, I was not.
Were you aware that We had fired a very large portion of its staff?
No, I was not.
How many times did your family members receive remuneration from this organization since you've been elected as Prime Minister?
As I said, my wife works on an unpaid basis for We and other organizations, and had it cleared by the Ethics Commissioner in advance for both her engagement, because she's been an advocate and a TV and radio host professionally through her entire career, that her activities with this organization and other organizations for free, with being reimbursed for expenses, was something that was cleared by the Ethics Commissioner when she first wanted to become an advocate around these issues with that organization.
You have a minute left, Mr. Barrett.
So every dollar that your wife received in reimbursement or in payment was cleared in advance by the Commissioner?
As I said, Mr. Barrett, this was unpaid work my wife was doing for a cause that she believes in deeply, talking about destigmatization of mental health, empowerment of young people, particularly girls. This is something that she believed in deeply. And yes, we got approval by the Ethics Commissioner that she could volunteer with this organization and have expenses related to that volunteerism reimbursed.
So I want to question, keep it tight.
Well, I want to know if the Prime Minister can tell us what due diligence looks like. We have an organization that had no assets. It was a shell corporation. They were in violation of bank covenants, a fired board chair. They were firing employees, and the government of Canada handed over a $500 million contract for them to administer. What was that due diligence that was done, sir?
The public service ensures that any third-party partner that we work with on delivery of a program is capable of delivering the program. They have a rigorous and strong process to do that. And I have confidence in our public service to be able to do that, particularly because during this time of pandemic, they had demonstrated with many third-party organizations an ability to get help to Canadians in record fashion when people needed it the most.
Thank you both. Zero. It's Mr. Polyev. 5 minutes, please.
Yes or no question, Mr. Chair. Prime Minister, you twice were found guilty of breaking the Ethics Act. After those two convictions, did you decide to read the Act?
You got 14 seconds, Prime Minister.
Yes, I have read the Act a number of times.
Are you aware of Section 21?
Yes, since I've read the Act, I'm aware of Section 21.
What does it say?
I can pull it up for you, but if you have it in front of you, you can remind me which.
Well, it says a
number
public
that is.
office holder, of which you are one, shall recuse himself or herself from any discussion, decision, debate, or vote in any matter in which, in respect of which he or she would be in a conflict of interest. Now, what you've admitted today is not just that you were in a conflict of interest, but that you consciously recognized in your May cabinet meeting that such a conflict might exist. That it didn't just slide by your desk, that you were consciously aware that there was an inappropriate link to your family that would put you in a conflict. Why did you, at that moment, not call the ethics commissioner and recuse yourself?
That is simply not true, Mr. Polyev. The issue of advancing issues for one's own family. And by the way, the ethics commissioner is looking into this right now, and I fully trust his judgment on determining it. But at the same time, my concern around recusing myself was a question around perceptions, because I knew full well that this Canada Summer Students Grant program was not going to directly benefit my mother or my brother.
Your 16 seconds are up. Your 16 seconds are up. I'm going to ask you again, because nobody believes you when you say you don't know how much money your family has got from the We Group. So you've had a month to look into that. You knew you were going to testify here. Again, how much money total have your brother, mother, and spouse received from this organization? How much?
That information has been publicly shared, but I will highlight.
Well, then tell me what it is.
My mother,
how much?
has
just the dollar figure
throughout her life.
The dollar figure, Prime Minister.
Various ways, and is proud
how much
of the work that she's done, and I'm proud of her.
How
as
much?
Well.
I'm looking for a dollar figure.
We can get that number for you if you like. It's been out in the media.
It's been in the media, but you don't know it?
I don't have it in front of me, and quite
you
frankly,
don't know how much your family has received from this organization, which you tried to give $500 million. Really?
Can I answer, Mr. Polyev?
I'm waiting. You haven't done an answer so far. Let's make this the first one.
My mother has worked as an advocate.
The dollar figure, Prime Minister.
Speaker for many good organizations across the country.
Mr. Prime Minister, you are being asked a direct question at a parliamentary committee.
To support her because she does her own work, and I'm proud of the work that she does. Point of order. But I do not feel that it is my responsibility to peer into the work my mother is doing, because I have
point of order to suspend.
That she's doing.
Point of order to suspend,
I've come to learn that the chairperson's power has gone out and is no longer part of this meeting. May I propose that we?
It's okay. We can keep. Prime Minister and I can continue talking.
No.
I suspected that might be a problem. It's very convenient timing for the lights to go out.
Look, I got a message to the effect that his power has gone out. I have no reason to distrust him.
I hope you don't pull the fire alarm now.
Yeah, well, look, there's no intent in my own private home here in the middle of a pandemic. I don't have a fire alarm.
Mr.
I
Fraser,
propose
The general process is that the vice chair assumes the chairing of the meeting. So we'll continue.
And that would be me. So we'll continue the meeting. And I now give the floor to the member for Carleton. Mr. Prime Minister, you have, I'm going to ask you one last time, how much did your family get from this organization? How much?
Have you read the Conflict of Interest Act, Mr.
Yes,
Poilievre?
I have.
How does it define family?
I'm asking you.
How does it define
I'm asking
family?
you how much your family got.
The Conflict of Interest Act defines family as spouse and direct dependents.
Point of order.
You're not going to answer that question.
Point of order.
So you're not going to answer the question then. So you're not going to answer the question about how much your family received. Okay, you're right.
Older gentlemen, if you
for working with we, and it was cleared by
Prime
the
Minister?
Ethics Commissioner ahead of time.
Okay.
Mr.
Point of order,
Poilievre,
can I welcome
Mr.
back Wayne Easter? Can I welcome back Wayne Easter, a man we've deeply missed? Come on, Wayne, where have you been? Were you a coffee?
Look,
I had things under control for you while you were gone.
I
God,
imagine
help us,
that,
Wayne.
Pierre, it wouldn't be the first time you tried to put my lights out, and that's exactly what happened, Pierre. We got a thunderstorm here. Anyway, where will you're well into your 5 minutes, but go with one last question.
Mr. Trudeau, I'm going to conclude by asking you, you claim that you have no knowledge of the amount that has been paid in expenses to your spouse. You correctly pointed out that the Act defines family as including a spouse. Therefore, you know you're under investigation regarding the Act. I'm going to ask you again, how much in total, and I'm looking for a dollar figure here, sir, how much did your spouse receive in reimbursed expenses or other benefits from this organization? How much?
Your original question, Mr. Poilievre, was how much was my immediate family?
I asked you a different question now. How much?
Mr. Poilievre, the Prime Minister has the floor.
My wife has never been paid since I was Prime Minister.
Reimbursed for expenses.
Mr. Poilievre, could we please have order? We'll allow the Prime Minister to answer the question, and then we'll move on to Ms. Zerowitz. Sorry, Julie. Mr. Prime Minister, you have about 30 seconds here.
The Ethics Commissioner has fully cleared my wife to continue her advocacy and her work with We Charity and other organizations.
How much?
In the kind of work that she's been doing all her life.
Just the dollar figure.
She's doing it unpaid for We. She is not being paid by We for her advocacy or for her podcasts. They are simply reimbursing her for expenses.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. And.
To step aside and ask Mr. Morneau to step down as Finance Minister. You said that the lobbyist register wasn't your job to look at, but answer, Mr. Fortin, since the past 4 or 5 months, the government and the Minister of Finance in particular has delivered assistance to millions and millions of Canadians who were in a very tough situation.
The floor is the Prime Minister's. If he could finish, please.
We had to make enormous differences for Canadians, and that's what we were focused on. That's very disappointing, Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Fortin. Mr. Angus, 2.5 minutes, and then on to Mr. Poilievre. Mr. Angus.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Prime Minister, 2017, after you're found guilty with the Aga Khan deal, you said, we are going to work with the Office of the Ethics Commissioner in the new year to ensure that as we go forward in full and complete compliance with the rules in place. You tell us that you held this project back, you did the due diligence, you were aware that there were perceptions that might be problematic. We're not talking about perceptions, we're talking about breaches of the law. In your due diligence, why did you not bother to talk to the conflict of interest, Commissioner. It is so obvious, Mr. Trudeau, that these conflicts were there. Why did you think it didn't apply to you?
Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. Angus, the public service came forward with a recommendation to Cabinet to move forward either with this specific third-party provider that was We Charity, or else not move forward with the program at all. That was the binary choice we proposed. I did not influence the public service to choose this organization. And indeed, when the public service came forward with this organization, I said, you know what? Let's put the brakes on it. Let's make sure that it's done absolutely everything right, because there are going to be questions because of the connections with my family on this. Yes, in hindsight, I should have recused myself, and perhaps that the program would be delivering for students right across the country right now. But well, I did not. Instead, I put the brakes on it and said, let's make sure that it is doing things the right way so that we don't have any communications or public problems.
Back to Mr. Angus.
I guess with all due respect, instead of continually throwing the civil service under the bus, I'm asking about your judgment, about your legal obligations, because the real losers here are the young people. Statistics Canada says that it's going to take 5 to 7 years for them to recover from the damage. And we had students asking why they were being denied CERB, asking why you were telling them that volunteerism is going to be great, they can work for less than minimum wage. You know, for students who have massive levels of student debt, they don't got $41,000 checks to cover off their losses. They were looking to you as their champion. And I'm really concerned, Mr. Prime Minister, that you think this issue of paying students, university students, a fair wage is somehow an attack on volunteerism. To be the champion of youth isn't to do a high five with Craig Kielburger.
Mr. Angus, your question, please. Sure,
because none of the money got out, not a dime. These students are still waiting. You failed them.
Mr. Prime Minister.
I'm happy to correct Mr. Angus. The Canada Emergency Student Benefit since May 15th has given to 724,000 applicants a total value of $2.1 billion directly for students. That's part of the $9 billion package. The student CERB has made a huge difference. The summer jobs we've created, the deferral of student loans. Yes, I regret that we weren't able to put out
Mr. Angus, the Prime Minister has the floor.
To recognize volunteerism that young people are doing right across the country. That is a piece of it that is disappointing and that I regret and I apologize for. But the ensemble of things that we've done to help students across this country in this historic pandemic has made a real difference in the lives of students and in communities across this country that are seeing young people step up and contribute.
We've had equal time, Prime Minister. We'll have to move on to Mr. Poilievre, and the concluding questions will go to Mr. Fraser. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Poilievre, and please don't shut my lights out this time, will you? Go ahead, Pierre.
Don't shut your own out either. You claimed that the program's purposes were threefold: help youth through the pandemic, help charities get through the pandemic, and help students pay for their post-secondary in the fall. Which of these could the Canada Summer Jobs Program not have done?
Actually, the aim of the three aims that I listed for the CSSG were encourage young people to step up, help out community organizations, and recognize volunteerism and reward volunteerism by students as a way of making a difference in this pandemic.
Back to Mr. Poilievre.
So you can't name a single one of these objectives that could not have been fulfilled by the Canada Summer Jobs Program.
That's not true, Pierre. The third one, recognizing volunteerism, is not done by the Canada Summer Jobs
Recognizing paid volunteerism. So you called it volunteerism so that you could take it outside of the Canada Summer Jobs Program and give it to your friends at We. My next question: when you directed,
Mr. Poilievre, the Prime Minister's got about 8 seconds to answer that one. Then we'll go to your question.
The CSSG was about recognizing and rewarding volunteerism. It's not about jobs. It was about volunteerism, and that, unfortunately, is something that we can't do because this program.
Back to Mr. Poilievre.
You just misused the word so that you could justify outsourcing a program that already effectively exists within the government. Now, when you did that, you directed $500 million, and yes, you did. You were the head of the cabinet. Did you know that the group to which you were directing that $500 million was in violation of its bank covenant? Yes or no?
That is not something that we had as information at that point.
Did you know that the government money would go into a real estate shell foundation instead of into the We Charity? Yes or no?
The details on the payment were worked out by our professional public service in terms of how the contribution agreement flowed.
So did you know that the chair of the board had resigned? Yes or no?
No.
So you clearly did not do any due diligence of your own. As the chair of the cabinet responsible for approving a decision, you should have had some basic facts. Sir, you were using $500 million of taxpayers' money here. You had a fiduciary responsibility. Why didn't you ask these questions?
We have flowed tens of billions of dollars through the CERB, through the
question isn't about the
benefit, through various ways to help Canadians, and we were very, very active in making sure that flows right. There are many, many different programs, and in cabinet government, we trust the ministers and the public service to do their jobs and make sure that things are delivered in the right way. And in this case, they did.
Monsieur le Président, le temps est venu.
Mr. Chair, the Prime Minister needs to stop blaming civil servants. It was his decision.
Channel, because I can't make you out. I'm hearing two languages at once.
Le temps est venu.
It's time for the Prime Minister to stop blaming the public service. He is an elected official who is responsible toward Canadians, and he needs to ensure that money is spent properly. It's not up to public servants who are forced to spend nearly $500 million to a group that paid his family nearly $500,000. Will the Prime Minister take personal responsibility for approving this enormous amount, which was given out to his friends? First of all, I'd like to make something clear. I have nothing but admiration and respect and deep gratitude for the public service, which is professional and has been able to deliver extraordinary programs during this pandemic to help millions of Canadians. It has had a real impact on the work that they're doing, and it continues to do this work. Their excellence was applied to programs for youth, and I have confidence that they made the right recommendation to deliver this program in the best way possible. And unfortunately, in part because I did not recuse myself, there was a perception that led to not being able to deliver this specific program. But the suite of programs that we deliver to Canadians, I have a simple question for you. How many times did a minister in your government need to break the Ethics Act before being sacked? How many times? We take it very seriously every time there are ethics issues. How many times? And how many times?
And he has the right to answer. Mr. Prime Minister.
We will obviously
how many times?
Any breaches of official codes. We will ensure that there are consequences, and we will look at every situation differently.
Fine. In English, I'll ask my last question.
Your last question is over. You're over your 5 minutes. Last night, you people were giving me the gears for not sticking and adhering to time. I'm adhering to time today. Mr. Fraser, you have the last round, 5 minutes, and then the Prime Minister will be released.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Prime Minister. Before I begin, I do want to express my gratitude for your assistance in securing a public inquiry into the mass shootings that took place in my home province of Nova Scotia. It means to the world to us at home. To the matter at hand, you've acknowledged during this meeting and previously that you should have recused yourself from the decision. I appreciate your willingness to admit that. You've also mentioned when it first came up at Cabinet, you pushed back. I've got competing concepts of a need to conduct due diligence and at the same time to have recused yourself. Of course, you remain responsible for the oversight of the policy direction and program implementation of the Government of Canada. And though I believe you were right to say you probably should have recused yourself from that conversation, I have difficulty how you would have simultaneously exercised the kind of oversight that caused you to push back during that May 8th meeting. Had you recused yourself, how would this additional oversight had taken place if you had not been involved in the process of the discussion at the Cabinet table?
That is an excellent question. The quick answer is that other members of cabinet would have stepped up and ensured proper oversight. But you do highlight one of the challenges of making policy in as condensed a fashion as we have during this pandemic. We have been flowing aid to Canadians, to different groups, filling gaps across the country with innovative partnerships, with creative ways of approaching things, because we needed to be there for Canadians. So yes, things were truncated, things were shortened. Programs that would have taken 6 months to develop and deliver were instead done in the matter of weeks. So it was a particularly challenging situation. And if you'll allow me, Mr. Fraser, let me also say thank you to you and to your fellow Nova Scotia MPs for being so strong in your advocacy to make sure that the answers get given to those families. Your leadership on this has been both personally and professionally appreciated.
Thank you very much. So the process that we've learned to date, that there was a public service recommendation. We learned 2 days ago when the Kielburgers were at committee that the public service actually recommended